Okay, so hello everyone. Thanks again for coming to our artist panel with Cate Mahnke, our artist for September, and Professor Nicholas Gulig of the Languages and Literature Department. So today we're going to discuss Kate's work, nostalgia, and everything in between. So before anything else, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Hannah. I'm the exhibit lead of Roberta's Art Gallery, and I'm a junior film studies and English creative writing major. Okay, so Nick.
So I'm a professor in the Languages and Lit department. My focus or my area of expertise, if you want to call it that, is poetry. I'm a poet. I teach poetry and literature. And I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Hey, Kate.
I'm Kate, and I graduated last year, and I worked at like a small ad agency before all the pandemic thing happened. But I am a graphic designer. I do painting on the side. Painting was probably like my initial gateway to digital media. But yeah, so that's me.
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks again for coming here. So let's start with Kate. Can you tell us about your exhibit and what's the inspiration behind it, the process behind it, and yeah, just tell us everything.
Yeah, so this exhibit specifically, it's named Nostalgia, and it's a gallery dedicated to my grandma who passed away about, I think, 6 years ago. And it's kind of like just a montage of different pieces from my childhood translated into art, and specifically painting and posters. So this gallery actually started in high school, and I had a concentration breadth of work that was dedicated to the Philippines, and the environment and the places and the food and kind of like the mood that it felt being in the Philippines. So I remember the Philippines as a very like warm, and like it was a place that I was raised at. I lived there for 9 years, so I was surrounded by a lot of uncles and aunts and grandparents, and that, I think, in a central part of my childhood is a huge inspiration of why I want to do this work. So it's a montage of saying thank you to my homeland, as well as just a nod to the identity that it helped me become now as an Asian American, and specifically a Filipino American in Wisconsin. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great because earlier I was hanging your things in the gallery, and I saw one of the artworks was made in 2010, so it's been like a decade to make this exhibit. So yeah, that's amazing to hear that. So can I ask what medium do you use usually?
Yeah, so it started out with acrylic, so that was kind of the base point. But then once I tapped into oil painting, I really enjoyed the way that it was a pretty volatile media, so it didn't dry right away. I'm one of those artists where it's like, it might look good one day, and then the next day I'm like, let's change it. So that oil painting just gives me that flexibility to keep adding on or keep editing. So there's that. But then I also tap into a little bit of oil pastels, which is definitely my favorite type of medium, because I can get really hands-on and dirty with the work that I do. So there's that media, and then of course the digital part, which I just use the Creative Cloud. So
Yeah, well, that's amazing, and yeah, I'm really like surprised by the like the like the range of your art. Like you have prints in the gallery and you have acrylics and oils. So yeah, I'm very excited for people to see this exhibit, and yeah, thanks again for allowing us to showcase it. So okay, so here's the fun part. So we're gonna discuss nostalgia and how it means to us, just to like give meaning to the art that we do, because I feel like um as important as art is for art's sake, it doesn't really it doesn't have weight if we don't um like use it to process a lot of things in our lives. And yeah, so let's start it off. Okay, so the first question is, define nostalgia. So let's start with Nick.
I think nostalgia is a really difficult word to think about, and it's a really difficult word to talk about, because it's really effervescent in a way. Like it's really hard to pin down, and there's so many different ways that it's been conceived of historically, and there's been so many different uses or projects towards which it's been placed. And so I think like a really important place to start, I think, is to kind of be able to make a distinction between, or to be specific about like the type of nostalgia that we're talking about. And the most helpful like framework, and I should say, and the kind of nostalgia that we're not talking about. And so, and obviously I can't speak for anyone besides myself, but like, you know, Kate, when I'm like looking at those paintings, there's definitely like a form of nostalgia that I see you trafficking in, and then there's a kind that I see you not trafficking in. And so I think maybe it's a good place to start would be to kind of like distinguish between what are some, at least kind of like two broad kinds of conceptions of nostalgia. Because one I think is really dangerous, and one I think is really, really fertile. And so like the dangerous one that I kind of want to just point to and then get as far away as possible is the kind of nostalgia, for example, that we see kind of like running rampant in the United States right now, right? So like there's this kind of like nostalgic longing for a kind of idealized kind of like political and cultural past, right? That I think "Make America Great Again," for example, is a phrase that's a weaponization of that kind of nostalgia, right? Like this kind of like, let's recreate or restore or resurrect this version of the country that used to be, but that is no longer or is in danger of becoming extinct or something like that, right? And so I want to think of that as a kind of like the term that's closest for me that I've found to that speaks to that is what the critic Slavana, I can't pronounce her name. Her name is Svetlana Boym. She's a critic, comparative literature at Harvard, and she calls this kind of nostalgia restorative nostalgia. So she says things like restorative nostalgia stresses home and attempts a kind of trans-historical reconstruction of the lost home. And then she'll talk about this other form of nostalgia, which is the kind that I'm much more interested in, which she calls a kind of like reflective nostalgia. And so she says, like, quote, reflective nostalgia dwells on the ambivalences of human longing and belonging and does not shy away from the contradictions of modernity, right? Where restorative nostalgia right, protects what it sees as an absolute truth or kind of like universal truth. Reflective nostalgia calls that universality, that kind of absoluteness of that truth into doubt. So kind of maybe a more less complicated way to say that is that restorative nostalgia, right? It's just kind of more conservative energy that posits a kind of static identity in the past and desires to resurrect it as it was in the present, whereas a reflective nostalgia understands that, right, that the past is past, and yet that there are traces and shadows and kinds of, maybe even like, I think the metaphor that works the best for me is that there are ghosts in the past that can kind of like teach us about where we are, who we are, and where it is that we might try to be headed without reaching for a kind of like direct or literal resurrection of the ghost itself, or kind of like seeing the ghost as like a touchstone or like a teacher who has a kind of something to offer us that is not going to kind of keep us locked in the past, but that will allow us kind of access to a kind of like more profound and I think arguably more kind of progressive. I don't mean progressive in the political sense, but I mean like a forward-facing future.
Yeah, that made me think a lot because I feel like for me personally, I see nostalgia in a more like I've never seen it as like as relating to history. I see it more of as like I see nostalgia as a way of looking back and seeing my past in periphery. So because I'm a writer and I'm also a photographer. So yeah, I feel like nostalgia for me is just like seeing my past in periphery and also like like immortalizing it in a way to hold on to that past that I have because for me I'm also Filipino American and I immigrated like a year ago, so my sense of memory is still vivid, and this is the way that I like hold on to that, like the pieces of my past that I still have in my brain and in my art. So yeah.
Yeah.
How about you?
I like that idea of periphery is really interesting there, or at least the way that you used it, because I mean, I'm not a photographer, but like that which is on the margins or at the edges of a photograph or of a painting, right, is not perhaps like the central subject itself, but it's kind of like that which frames and informs and kind of gives meaning to, right, that which is at the center of the photograph.
Definitely. Okay, Kate.
Yeah, I love how you kind of talked about like nostalgia in two different parts, which is the restorative and reflective, which I think as I was writing my kind of thesis on what my exhibit was about, it became very apparent that the first part, which is the paintings and all of that, it's like what you said would be restorative, which it would be for me like a longing for my childhood and the past and the people that surrounded me, and specifically my grandmother, where she became my role model, and then her passing away. I think that clicked onto the reflective part of nostalgia where the past is gone, right? And then I think my other side of work, the poster part, is more of a reflective part of nostalgia where I am letting go of that past and letting go of the feeling that I've kind of just almost romanticized living here in America and always wanting to have that same sort of freedom, I guess, of just going out to the backyard and picking some bananas off of a tree or something like that, to a reflective nostalgia molding me into a different identity and looking the past more as a fundamental part of my identity rather than a separate part, which I think I've definitely tried to hone into with my posters, and specifically now as I grow into an artist, like I want it to be more of like a voice to speak out the past to create a new future, sort of, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
That's weird. Like, I think how do I say this? Like, nostalgia and identity are so interestingly like linked, especially I think in the kinds of situations, and I realize that like all our situations are different. Right, so like I wasn't born in Thailand. I was born in the United States. My mom immigrated when she was 19, you know, and then I was born here in Wisconsin. And both of your situations are slightly different than that. And yet it's like we all kind of have, maybe I'm putting words in your all's mouths, but like, I think we all also have the experience of like being, right, Southeast Asians in Wisconsin, right?
For sure.
And so I think, which has an effect on identity in a certain way. So for example, right, like 9 times out of 10, right, when I walk into a room, it's like there's a spotlight, that obviously not a literal spotlight, but like that there's a spotlight that comes down, and it's like, you know, like a brown person has now entered the room.
Right.
And like suddenly it's just like, you know, because I'm usually the only person of color in a room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless I'm in my house. And so when I think about like my nostalgia for Thailand, like part of it is the absence of that, right?
Absolutely.
Where it's like, where like the focus isn't ever on me. Like I just kind of like blend into the background, right? So like identity, like with like a bunch of arrows pointing to it with like a spotlight on it, kind of like disappears, and it's no longer having to like be cognizant, right, of the fact that I am walking around with this identity, right? So in some weird, interesting way, like my nostalgia for Thailand is a longing for the loss of my like Southeast Asian identity, if that makes sense, right? Because it's like, it's not an ish, it's so rarely something that I have to be cognizant of, right, when I'm there, and there's something really liberating about that. Whereas here, like everywhere, like every face that you encounter is a reminder that like, yes, I have a Southeast Asian identity.
Right.
So it's, you know, it's just weird how that works.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, especially living in the suburbs, where I felt like moving here when I was 9, I've kind of learned to, you know, we're kind of taught to just assimilate, right? And especially going to school in the suburbs has kind of, I guess it helped disappear all of those, how do you say this? It kind of just makes you forget of that identity that you had as an Asian, just as an Asian period, being an immigrant as well. So you learn to assimilate, and you forget the past very quickly, especially living here for more than 10 years. And the longing, the nostalgia in that is, I guess, like trying to find who you are, and your own sense of home in a place that doesn't look exactly like you.
Like, I don't, like, to what degree do you think you can ever truly assimilate? I don't know. Like, my mom moved here when she was 19 and she's 70 something now. And so she's like more, it's really funny when I go back to Thailand with her, because she doesn't go back very often, especially now since her parents are gone and her sister's gone. She doesn't really have any immediate family there anymore. All her friends are here, right? Her family's here. Like, she's more out of place there than she is in the United States, right? And yet, you know, she's lived here for, you know, 50 some years, but like her accent still sets, you know, still like sets her radically apart. She still has a lot of trouble like speaking with strangers on the telephone, and things like that. So like, and you know, she too is almost always the only person of color in her room, at least in Wisconsin. And so like, she's never, to what degree, like, can you ever fully assimilate? Like, even if you're like me and you were born here, right?
That's true, yeah.
I was born here and I don't even feel that I've ever truly assimilated. And then, you know, obviously when I go back to Thailand, my Thai is very terrible. And so like, I can't really assimilate there either. I mean, I can pass visually, but as soon as I try to interact with someone, you know, it becomes very clear that I'm not Thai. And so I think that comes back to a question that Hannah had posted in her email to us, that was something like why might nostalgia be important now, right? To you. And I think it has to do with that, right? Because I think part of the immigrant experience, right, or part of being a person of color in the United States, part of that experience is an experience of like never like fully belonging, right? So like, I don't ever fully feel at home here or there. Like I'm always caught in this in between space, right? And I think that that's the space that nostalgia, especially reflective nostalgia more so than restorative nostalgia, but I think it's that in between kind of shadowy space of contradictions that nostalgia kind of working in nostalgic mediums, kind of tapping into nostalgic energies. I think that's what, as an artist, I think it places you, right? It doesn't place you in America or it doesn't place you in Thailand, right? It places you somewhere, somewhere in between.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I like cut you.
Oh no.
That's very interesting because I feel like the three of us have like different senses of nostalgia because like Cate moved here 10 years ago and then Nick was here ever since, and then I'm like here since last year. So when you mentioned the thing about language, because I speak fluently in Filipino and Cate also does speak fluently in Filipino, but yeah, it's weird because when you don't speak to Filipinos as often, like that part of you and that language like slips away, and then you know, it's like it has to be practiced or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever have? My mom would sometimes speak about this, and other immigrants that I've talked to have also talked about this to varying degrees, about returning back home after living in the United States, and how just by virtue of living in the United States, by virtue of what the United States is within, I'm speaking from my experience now, my mom's experience, like the kind of position of like power, privilege, affluence, modernity that the United States occupies within like the kind of like colloquial Thai imagination, right? Because, you know, because Thailand, you know, is a developing nation, right? Especially compared to the United States. And so to most Thais, right, and especially if they aren't wealthy, the United States is this kind of like symbol of all these things that they don't have, but maybe in some kind of abstract sense wish they had. And so when my mom would return home or something, she would oftentimes speak about feeling as though people looked at her differently, right? Or for, I think maybe more specifically, like my grandparents, as far as, you know, as far as like the Thai social hierarchy went, we're pretty well off. Like my grandfather was an architect. They had by Thai standards, a nice home, right? They were wealthy enough way back in the 60s before like going off to school in Western countries was a thing. They were able to afford to send one of their daughters to a Western university, which was a really, really, really big deal, right, back in the 60s. But they weren't able to afford to send both of their daughters, right, to Western universities. And so that kind of like, that difference between my mom and her sister like created like this, you know, like this wall between them, because like she had access to all these privileges that her sister didn't, right? And I was wondering if like when you go back, do you feel any of, I mean, I don't know what you would call it, like the guilt of the privileges, right, that you have, where so many people like from your, you know, from the Philippines don't have the opportunity to attend, you know, universities, etc.
Yeah, definitely. I would say, so my initial major was actually nursing, which is a very familiar career path for a lot of Filipino Americans. One, because it pays the bills, and two, because it pays the bills. So I was in nursing school for 3 years until I finally found the guts to tell my parents I couldn't go that route. And so that all of those 3 years was guilt of trying to figure out how to tell them that, yes, you've sacrificed all this much, but I'm still not going to pursue what you want me to pursue, which, yeah, taps into what you were saying. When we went back to the Philippines, I think it was 2012, you definitely feel the sense of that, you know, that you've had a lot more opportunities than my cousins who lived in the Philippines had, and an immense amount of guilt, because then you're up in this podium, and there's definitely that American dream podium in the Philippines where if you're American, you're wealthy and you're rich, right? And you can afford all these things, and they look highly towards, you know, the Western civilization. And as a person who had lived in the United States, I definitely don't see it like that as an immigrant living here. And it's a juxtaposition between what they think and then what I think now, where it's like, no, you really gotta work and you really have to earn to get up there. But even so, it's hard to claim all their idealizations about being a Filipino American to their high standard, I guess. And I guess even as an artist, I feel that guilt because I'm like, you know, I could be earning so much more money, and I could be sending money to my family members in the Philippines and help them, you know, and I'm really in no position to do that. I'm just trying to survive, you know. But I definitely feel that like responsibility and ownership to be able to like uplift voices that are the same as mine, and to celebrate the culture that I grew up in, even though that might be different to what Filipinos in the Philippines think that is. But it's definitely hard to find that niche here in America, to find that celebration as a Filipino American, and not just and I guess it's hard to fit both bubbles, the Filipinos and the Filipino Americans, because of that ideation, I think.
Yeah, and I think that also relates back to identity and how like we navigate different identities when we're in different like social spheres. So yeah, that's definitely that, and which again relates back to nostalgia, because I feel like as people of color we live in a liminal space, and we always there's this sense of there's the in between where we exist in between homeland and here, and I think that's ultimately what nostalgia is about. It documents that in between space.
For sure.
And whatever our struggles are, as people of color, as immigrants, and even as Asian Americans, even though we have non-Black privilege, we also experience a lot of like discriminations, especially in the Midwest, because we're surrounded by predominantly white social spheres. So yeah, and the reason why it's important to talk about this right now is because it's about time. It's about time that we should talk about the Asian American experience, and how it is valid, and it isn't monolithic, as I said. It exists. It's different in every way, but there are also a lot of commonalities that we share, and that gives us an opportunity to uplift one another as people of color in the Midwest. So do you have any other insights that you want to add?
Do either of you like we've been talking about nostalgia like as like a form of celebration, right? So in that way, maybe nostalgia, and when we talk about that way, it runs parallel. So I'm speaking as a poet here, but like it has like an odic quality to it, you know, like an ode, you know, like the kind of like poems of praise. But I don't think that it's just that. Like, I think nostalgia is also really sad. Like, I think it also has a kind of like elegiac kind of like undercurrent to it, right? So it's like, in that way, it's like, you know, like it's a longing for something that isn't there. And that thing that isn't there, whether it be like a home or a person, right? Whatever, that person or that home to various degrees is a source of joy, right? But what's implicit in the act of longing for it is that it's gone, right? That you don't have access to it, right? So the nostalgic space is always one in which the thing that you are longing for isn't accessible to you, right? So it's like, it's limbo, right? It's purgatory.
Yeah.
It's not heaven, it's not hell, it's
Mhm.
it's something in between. And the moment that you return home, right, it's no longer nostalgia. And so in that way, it also kind of operates like eros. It operates like desire. Like, you can only desire by definition so long as you do not have, right? You can only desire that which you don't possess, right? So like, for me, the kinds of like two parallel forces or two parallel energies or two parallel like modes of expression are like the elegy on the one hand, and then like desire or eros on the other. And so I think those are just two other ways that I think about nostalgia, is that it has this kind of elegiac quality and then this kind of like desiring quality, both of which are defined by disconnection, right? By being removed, by always being kind of in pursuit of a goal that you can't ever really achieve, right? So like, what the elegy, just to focus in on that one for a second, like what the elegy does, right, is that it attempts, right, but of course it's a failed attempt. It attempts to bring the deceased person back, right? So like, Kate, you were talking about like in some ways, like, you created this art for your grandmother, right? And so there is this kind of elegiac quality, right, to the paintings.
Absolutely.
Or like poems about like my dad passed away 5 years ago, so like, whenever he is making appearances in my poems, right, they automatically, at least there's a part of them that become elegiac, and there's this attempt to kind of like resurrect the ghost, right? But it's a failed attempt, right? Like, a ghost, you can bring the ghost back, but the ghost isn't the person. The ghost is like the shadow of the person. The ghost is just part of the person. It's always, it's never fully the person, right? And then the ghost can never fully like be in the world that you're in, right? The ghosts are these really interesting creatures. And we'll talk a lot about this, Hannah, in class in the fall. Like, ghosts are these really interesting creatures because they have this kind of really wonderful ability to kind of like slip in and just to slip back and forth between worlds while never really ever fully belonging, right, to one or the other. So like in Buddhism, we have this like the story of like the hungry ghosts, right? That they're not in hell, they're not living, but they kind of just like wander back and forth, right, between, they're forever unsatisfied. So ghosts can move back and forth between worlds, right? So they kind of possess this quality that we too wish that we possess, like this ability to kind of move back and forth between like America and between like the new land and the old land. And ghosts also are able to kind of like slip in and out of selves. They're able to kind of like effortlessly move in and out of identities, right? Like the idea of a being possessed, right, or possessing someone is to like inhabit it's to put on a mask, right? Like the ghost, when a ghost is hopping from form to form, from body to body, slipping in and out, effortlessly slipping in and out of identities in this way, that as immigrants, we have to become fluent in that. Like that's a survival strategy, right? Like you have to be able to like put on your American face, or then put on your Thai face, depending on the context. So I think what ghosts are able to do is something that we are trying to kind of recreate right? With that, like by infusing art with those nostalgic qualities. I think the nostalgic quality is really kind of like it's kind of like a spectral energy. It's a ghost force.
For sure.
That, haunts our work. And I don't mean haunt in a bad way. I mean, it's just there.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely dealing with my grandmother's loss was really hard for me, and I think that painting had helped me try to capture that. I think for me, the longing of the past, when I think of that, and my grandma specifically, I think of colors, and I know that might sound a little weird, but it's just the way that I pick up different types of color schemes and how I put that on canvas. Every step of the way, I'm thinking of a different type of memory that I had with her, and looking through pictures, and it's a restorative type of nostalgia, because in a way, even though she's not with me, I am processing, and she's helping me deal with that loss, and then helping me put that out in the world, because then something about bottling it up just doesn't fully help me express that sorrow and that grief.
Yeah. So like what you're trying to do is like create on the canvas, or in my sense, or my version of that, like on the page, like you're trying to create a world or a landscape, right, between the world of the living, where you are, and the world of the dead, right, where she is, right. Through these kind of creative acts of the imagination, you're creating a landscape that's kind of halfway between the two, right? Where, in my case, where my dad can come back halfway, right? But then I too leave the real world, right, through the acts, through the imaginative act, and I meet him there, right? So like, I meet him halfway, right, between the lands of the living and the lands of the dead, right, between the here and the there, right? So like, to leave the land of the living, even if it's only to like leave halfway, right, it's like you too have to die a little bit, right? Like you have to become ghost like yourself in order to meet the ghost coming from the other direction, right? So like art is always, I think art is a haunted space, because it's neither real nor unreal, right? It lives in the middle, and when you're there, I mean, I'm not a painter, but like when you're painting or when you're writing, right, like when you're in your imagination, you're not completely in the real world. You're not completely, I mean, maybe some artists are, but like there's some poets I'm like, they're not really but like you're still partially there, right? You know, like you're still like using the things of the world that you have partially left. Like you're still like bringing those flowers from the land of the living, right, or whatever it is. You're using pieces or representations of pieces from the real world to construct this liminal in-between world where you can be a ghost and your father or your grandmother can be a ghost, and you guys can sit down and connect again, right? I think there's this what is it, this a writer named Michael Chabin, and he writes about nostalgia, and he says, he has this definition of it that I thought was really, really useful. So he says, my work at times is criticized for being overly nostalgic or too much about nostalgia. This is partially my fault, because I've written a lot about the theme of nostalgia, partially the fault of political and economic systems that abuse nostalgia to foment violence and to move units. But this isn't nostalgia's fault. Nostalgia is a valid, honorable, ancient human emotion that has many variants in other languages, most of which are untranslatable. Nostalgia that arises such scorn and contempt in American culture, predicated on some imagined greatness of the past, or the inability to accept the present, is the one that interests me the least. The nostalgia that I write about, that I study, that I feel, is the ache that arises, and this is the definition that I love, from the consciousness of lost connection, right? So it's the connection, not the thing itself, but the thing connecting you to the thing that you're trying, that nostalgia is aimed at kind of living there, right? In the moment of connection, right? Like you're not trying to restore the past. You're not trying to I'm not trying to bring my father back. I'm trying to live for a second longer with the connection that I had with him, right? Which is different from him, right? Like he is his own person, right? And can exist independently of me. But there's this thing, right, that connects us, this bridge between us. And that nostalgia is the ache that arises from the consciousness of that connection starting to like dissipate and become weaker. So when we turn to art, then in order to create that connection, like that world between worlds is that bridge, right? That's the place where you can connect with someone even when they're gone, or connect with a place even when that place is not accessible to you, literally, right? Literally accessible.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that all of these things are somehow expressed in the artwork that Cate did. So for everyone who's watching this, we would love it if you could visit Roberta's art gallery in the University Center and see the artworks for yourself and process your personal nostalgias and the ways that you have experienced it. So once again, thank you. Thank you to Nick and to Cate, and see you guys soon. Okay, bye.